Hogwarts Castle, a 5-inch gauge locomotive, part 16, completing the painting. Here I'm painting the other side of the front wheel set. The problem with painting these wheels in my environment is very small. My workshop is a large garage built onto the side of my house. And approximately a third of the way into the building there is a wall that I built with a door, and I'm in what I call the outer part of the workshop, right next to a wide open roller shutter type door. And this is where I do things like painting, as you can see, and grinding and polishing, generally dirty jobs. And as I mentioned in the last episode, it's been very cold lately, and that's why there's been a gap in the series, because I couldn't paint in the temperature in the outer part of the workshop. But now things have got better and it's warm enough to allow me to paint the wheel sets. Back in the inner part of the workshop, and I'm on the workbench masking the parts of the middle wheel set. To mask off the eccentrics and the eccentric rods, I'm using a polythene bag, as you can clearly see. I'm also using some masking tape just to tie the polythene bag in place. Just what I like, a quick and easy job. Not forgetting to mask off the crank pins. The crank pins on the centre wheel sets are much longer than the others because they hold the coupling rods and the connecting rods. So now I do have a bit of a problem. You've just seen me painting a wheel set in the outer part of the workshop, and that's still there and the paint's drying nicely. So I'm going to leave it where it is, and besides, this wheel set would not fit into the jig that I made, owing to all the eccentrics and eccentric rods sticking out of the middle part. I've supported this wheel set on a large copper tube, and I'm going to paint it in the main part of the workshop, on the workbench. I don't normally paint in the main part of the workshop, but to speed up the process and get it all down on video in one go, that's why I'm doing it. Even though the door into the outer part of the workshop is open, there really is insufficient ventilation. In this case, I'm using a very different technique for painting this wheel set. I'm wearing a breathing mask, but wearing a breathing mask is not always the answer. You can still taste and smell the cellulose thinners. There are two things I could possibly do. One thing would be to buy a diver's helmet and have a friend of mine outside with an air pump, pumping fresh air into the diver's helmet. But I have a simpler method. I just don't breathe in. I hold my breath, and just before I'm about to expire, I rush outside and gulp in some fresh air. Then I take several deep breaths and hold my breath again, go back into the workshop and continue the painting. It's unorthodox, it works, and I haven't died yet. That's it for the spray painting for the moment. Now I need to paint the chassis, and this is quite a big job. As I showed in the previous video, for the other side I went all over it using some panel wipe first, and I've done the same with this side. So now it's time to paint this side, and it's just as tedious as painting the other side. But you've got a choice. You can either turn off and watch something else, or continue to the end, because there are one or two interesting things near the end of the video. You could always phone the Samaritans and speak to someone who would lend a sympathetic ear. I think I'll do that when I finish this painting job. Once again, I'm using the flat brush rather than a round brush. It gives a much more flatter, even finish. As previously, I painted the side nearest me and also painted the other side. And I'm doing exactly the same again. Painting around the valve gear is quite tricky, but by using a flat brush it makes it easier. I want to get plenty of paint on this chassis. You have to remember that steam locomotives generally are dirty, smelly and wet. And no, I'm not going to make any jokes at this point. It's very important to make sure that you get a good, thick covering of paint on the chassis to prevent rusting. And here is a top tip. Once I finish brush painting the chassis, I sprayed it as well, but I can only spray it in the areas which are exposed. Oh no, everything's going dark. Oh, that's better. It was time to breathe. It's most important to remember that when you're holding your breath, you do need to breathe occasionally. With a bit of practice, it's surprising the accuracy that you get when using an aerosol spray can. There isn't that much overspray. This is particularly noticeable in this clip, where I'm spraying the front part. As you can see, the paint is just going where I'm aiming. Well, more or less anyway. But there's none really gone on the lubricator base. I don't need to paint the cylinders because these are going to be reclad in metal sheet very shortly. Once again, outside for a couple of good lungfuls of air and then back in to continue spraying the next part. A health and safety disclaimer. This holding your breath method while painting is only applicable to small models, because if you were painting a car, a van or a truck, you would probably inadvertently expire midway through the job and spoil the job. But it works okay for this. This is actually quite a good way of painting. I've used it frequently. If it's a really smooth flat surface, I would rub down between coats. But even without rubbing down, the final finish looks good, and more importantly, it looks like it's been sprayed, which of course it has. But when the engine's finished and finally reassembled, no one will be any the wiser other than you and I. Anyone looking at the engine will think, oh, that's a nice spray job. The quality of the paint does help though, and I must admit that this HMG Paints Satin Black is really good to work with. In this clip I've just sprayed the buffer stock, and I did this on purpose. I'm not entirely stupid. And before some fool writes in and says, are you aware that you've painted the buffer stock? I'm removing the paint. Using a cloth, I'm taking no chances. Once again, a bonus feature of this episode is the chassis sat on the bench with the paint drying. As you can see, some of the paint has gone on the bench, but this will be easy to remove with some cellulose thinners and a cloth. You will be pleased to know that that is really the end of the major painting sequence. From now on, there'll be a little bit of painting, but it will be mainly reassembly. That's it for this episode. I'll leave you with the paint drying while I go back into the house, have a cup of tea and do some breathing exercises, in an attempt to reoxygenate my remaining brain cell. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful.